All right, the first question is, what role does common sense have in planning and implementing class instruction? Um, I feel like the chapter was really quick to put a bad label on common sense. And I think the goal of this was to increase the importance of best practice, which I believe in. Best practice is the goal, but that doesn't mean we should do the opposite of common sense. In the example they gave, they said not to tell a student to get back in their seat, which, based on behavior, this may be the best practice after observation and spending time with that particular student, but we can't throw out common sense and just do whatever we want. We need to dismiss common sense when best practice says otherwise. So I think that's really the main goal. We still need to use common sense in the classroom as educators. So number two, a case study may focus on an individual or a single individual. What are the values and limitations of focusing on a single person case study? Obviously, a single person case study would be for very specific circumstances. Maybe you need a volunteer for something that has risk to it, but I think in any study, increasing the sample size as close to the population as you can will benefit that study. So having a sample of just one is obviously less beneficial, but these could be good for those circumstances where they're more experimental, and it could lead up to, if it's successful, lead to another study that has a larger sample size. So that could be some benefits of that. But overall, I would say a study with just one person could be not the best, because every person has so many outlying factors that will influence that. Having just one person being influenced by all their personal differences could change the results of that study, versus having a group kind of neutralizes those factors a little bit. All right, and number three is about Jared and Tamara. They can change their jobs. What about these students attending each school? Where does choice fit into their lives? So I like this question. It's really tough, because a lot of times students have no say in where they go to schools, where parents often have that choice, but they don't really always have that choice either. So in this case, just the inner city school had less resources available to them. If parents of that student wanted to move schools, they could, but it might often be the case that at these lower achieving schools that have less resources, that may be families that have less ability to move schools. So the students may end up getting a little bit stuck in the situation, or the families may be stuck in that situation a little bit. If you're in an underachieving region and maybe have a low socioeconomic status, it will be difficult for families and students to get that higher level of education at those schools with more resources and just better or more optimal teaching available. So number four, how does bias, or is bias, a part of our lives, especially in our teaching? I think it's safe to say that everyone has some amount of bias. It's hard to say otherwise. I think as teachers and educators, we need to focus on ourselves and look for our own bias so we can dismiss that, just so we're not teaching differently to different students or different populations because of our own beliefs, whatever reason we may have those. I just think it's a very important thing as a future educator, teachers and educators in general, to really examine that bias in themselves, and as peers, teachers should work together to dismiss bias in the classroom. That'd be very good, and something good to teach to students as well. So, number 5, the book says, a group may be considered a minority group if it is less powerful than the majority group. Other than power, what else might be used to constitute a minority group? Obviously, this was mentioned, but the population size is another big factor. While there's the whole thing about 1%ers having tons of power, and 1% of the population has 99% of the wealth, and that whole trend. So, I mean, population size is definitely a big factor, even when sometimes power is held by the minority. Another thing that could make a less powerful group or something else that might constitute a minority group, maybe is a group that is looked at negatively or discriminated against, even if they may hold more power or may hold the majority in numbers. If it's a group that's looked at negatively, it could force them to be the said minority. And then even in the other direction, in like ability versus disability, let's say looking at students, you could have honors students where it's just a select few students are more advanced. They have more potential, or one could even say power, in the classroom or in their schooling, but they could be considered the minority based off other factors, or even the fact that it's a smaller amount of them, and they could get different instruction or just perform differently in a school setting. So there's just a few. And then lastly, number 6, what have you seen in your school field experiences being done to address the environmental differences noted in the text with regard to SES, socioeconomic status? In one of the schools I went to, actually all the classrooms were provided with Chromebooks, so that all the students in that school had that technology available to them. And even in just the 20 or however many hours I was there, they definitely were utilizing these heavily. I don't know if that was part of the grant or they were required to use them a certain amount and show that, but I assume it was a grant that got these Chromebooks, because I remember hearing they might not have them the following year, which was interesting. And but I think that was cool to, at least for that year, have them to level the playing field a little bit, for at least when the students were in school, they all had this technology available to them, which was definitely a positive thing. That was a good circumstance for that. And then also, I think it was in that same school, I think it was Ocoee Middle, but they were, I forget what they called it specifically, but they'd have sectioned off time where students would, I believe it's underachieving students or whatever, maybe it was whatever subject a student underachieved in most, would have sectioned off time that was a less or a lower teacher-student ratio, where they could work on the areas they were struggling with. So I think, this is less specific to socioeconomic status, but it could be reflective of that. If certain students had less resources, this extra time and the lower student-to-teacher ratio would be a great resource for students with lower socioeconomic status or other circumstances that may cause them to have lower achievement. It's just it was a good resource, and it seemed like a well-structured time and effort to help students achieve at the level that they really could. So that's it.